Welcome to KSOK Uncensored. Tonight's guest is the Paul Manafort. Paul, thank you so much for being here with us this evening.
Well, Kristen, it's good to be with you tonight.
Oh, absolutely. You are an incredible person. I've done a lot of research into your accomplishments, and I think it's important that people realize, though you've been in the limelight for the most part over the past 6-7 years, you have achieved so much more in life. But let's start with most recent. You authored your first book, Political Prisoner, Persecuted, Prosecuted, but Not Silenced. Amazing title, and your story I cannot wait to read cover to cover. Talk to me though about the process while you were writing this book. What type of emotions came to the surface as you relived these horrific experiences?
I would say it's more therapeutic. It allowed me to really put all of this behind me. Because originally, when I started to write the book, I was focusing on explaining to the American people who I was, because that wasn't who the character that the special counsel and all of my enemies put out there of me was total fiction. And I was not able to respond because I had a gag order on me and I was in solitary confinement. So it was important to me to let there at least be a record of the truth. But as I started to write the book, I then realized, watching the Biden administration, because I finished this book at the end of last year, so I had the first year of his administration in the time frame that I wrote the book. I started watching the Biden administration pick up where the Obama administration left off, which is targeting conservatives and conservative groups and organizations just because they're conservative, just because they disagree. I saw Biden create the Department of Homeland Security Bureau of Disinformation, which was meant to declare American citizens domestic terrorists. I started to talk about what the American people needed to be prepared to do in order to take back their country. And if they did do that, when they needed to start. And in the book, I go through a lot of the details of my experience related to what was happening last year under Biden, to show the connection of the way the playbook of the left treats everybody who disagrees with them.
Right. And I know on very small scale, I've experienced that as well. Deplatforming, right? So, and it just goes on from there. So I think that's incredibly important that, in a sense, you sacrificed reliving this traumatic experience to wake people up. And I appreciate that so much. I want to ask you about something. Understanding you're a man of faith. While you were in solitary confinement for 10 and a half months in an 8 by 12 room, did you ever feel forsaken by God?
I felt the power of prayer every day. I knew from my own life and campaigns and politics that if I'm going to be sitting in a cell that's, as you say, 8 by 12, with no windows, no access to people, no ability to get outside, I had to create an environment that I could control. So I built a schedule, and the schedule started with reading the Bible every day, and prayer. And then I built out writing and reading and exercise that I could do in the cell, so that I had a full day, even though I was, by myself and locked away. And there were times during the day when I'd be sitting there and all of a sudden would feel a rush through my body. Well, I knew what that was. That was people praying for me. I mean, I could feel it.
Wow.
All of a sudden I had this strength that just pushed through my body, and it was often. It wasn't just now and then. It was often, and then I'd get letters from people saying they're praying for me, their prayer groups and things like that. So faith was key. I mean, faith, family, and knowing I was innocent are what got me through that 11 months of solitary confinement, and even through the year I spent in prison as well. Without faith, I don't know if I could have done it. But I mean, the Bible, I started reading St. Paul, my namesake, and his discussion of the purpose of suffering and how God has a purpose for suffering. And I shouldn't look at what I was experiencing, but know that there's a purpose for it. And I now see, yes, I can see it. I mean, I have a pulpit now to be able to warn the American people of the excesses that exist out there and how the woke left, they need to treat seriously, not just something that's out in Washington or up in California or Portland. They need to understand that it could be in their hometown, their street, as Lee Zeldin saw, your own house and front yard. And it's so I started to see the purpose of suffering and started to see why God put me through it.
That's incredible. So it almost sounds like your faith actually increased through this
Oh,
experience.
there's no question. There's no question about that. I mean, I always was a person of faith, but I mean, I was living it in a real way every single day with no distraction. And when
Wow.
you have no distractions, you all of a sudden can sense faith in a very different way.
I can imagine. Oh wow, that's incredible. I didn't know how you were going to answer that question. It's just really incredible to hear that from you and talk to us. I'm just a curious person by nature. What type of exercises were you able to do in that small space to keep your
Well,
body
yeah,
fit?
nothing that I could, I had to create. There were no weights or anything like that I could use, so I had to use a lot of calisthenics. I had to do, use sit-ups and push-ups and things that keep my body limber. I mean, I knew that I needed to keep my body, from atrophying, and I need to keep my mind from atrophying. It's so I built programs and strategies to do both, and even with that, I mean, I felt a deterioration to some degree. I mean, it's so I went through the diet, and went through the exercise in ways that would at least minimize the distraction and the deterioration.
Oh, that's incredible. I mean, that's what else can you do, right? Otherwise, you lay there and, like you said, atrophy. I mean, I just can't even begin to imagine that amount of stress. Not only psychologically is damaging, but physically as well. And I'm assuming early on, correct me if I'm wrong, but early on, you had to have exhibited some physical symptoms merely from this incredible amount of stress you were experiencing.
Well, yes, because I was worried about my family because they were not coming just after me. They were coming at trying to destroy my family. They were just, create all kind of obstacles for my children, for my wife, and that's what worried me more than anything else. And I said that to my wife before they put me into solitary, because I was stressing out when I was living at home, trying to deal with these bullets coming from every direction. And she said something to me that ended up being impactful still to this moment. And she said to me, because I told her I was worried that they're taking away everything we'd built up in our lives, and she wasn't going to be taken care of. My kids were going to be at risk. And she stopped me and she said, no, you're wrong. She said, we started with nothing. If we finish with nothing and still have each other, that's okay. That's enough. And that made all the difference in the world to me.
Oh, that actually makes me feel a little emotional
It's not
because
good.
there are not that many women, men that would respond that way. Let's just be honest. That is amazing. That is how your wife responded, and that had to have been a huge relief for you to hear her say that. I watched your recent interview with Tucker Carlson, and you mentioned that your marriage today is really stronger than ever, despite what they have done to you. I mean, how does a marriage survive that level of reputational damage and financial devastation?
Well, because both my wife and I knew who I really was. So we both knew the person they were trying to depict and portray me as was not a real person. We understood the game they were trying to play. And as I said, on the financial matters, when I raised that with my wife, she reminded me that we started with nothing. And if we finished with nothing but still have each other, that's all we need. And that stayed with me throughout the whole time in prison and really impacts me even today.
Ah, I love that. I love that so much. Tell her I said hello, would you? I just think she sounds like an incredible woman. And, I feel like that resonated with me so much because my husband's a Portland police officer. And while he was going through battling Antifa every night for 124 nights straight, I something came out of me that just made me want to protect him, even though he's quite capable of protecting himself. I became just this fierce wife that no one would mess with, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing today. I'm fighting to get the truth out there, and so I think that really resonated with me that she did the same for you. At least that was my takeaway.
Absolutely.
I
If
love
if there's one person, the people who came after me don't want to be in a room alone with, it's her, not me.
Yes. I love that so much. That's fantastic. That's what you need on your side. I love it. Jumping back to where this all began. So you are what, born and raised in Connecticut, or at least raised in Connecticut, a very blue collar area. Your father went into the military a Democrat, because that's just what the family was, right? Came out a Republican, and then went on to run and be elected as mayor of that town for three different terms.
Right.
And that's an incredible background. When did you realize that you wanted to somewhat follow in his footsteps?
Yeah. Well, my father came back from World War II, and he became a Republican because he felt like Americans had been over there dying to free Europe, and that at Yalta, President Roosevelt cut a deal with Stalin and gave away Eastern Europe. And to my father, that was a betrayal of what Americans had spilled their blood for. And so he came back and was a Republican on principle. And then in a Democratic town, by 4-1 Democratic town, he was elected mayor as a Republican 3 times on a very simple platform. He would be the working class mayor. He would take care of people for what they need, not just serve the office. It's a lot of what Donald Trump said many years later when he ran for president in 2016. What he convinced me of and showed me was the importance of principle in politics, the importance of trying to use government to make people's lives better, not make your life better. And that sense of service stayed with me, and motivated me to get involved in politics.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I just learned something last night, that you actually lived in Ukraine for
Yeah.
10 years. What
Well,
what
I
was
was
the
active there. I was active there for 10 years. Spent a lot of time there. Know the country very well. And what I was doing over there was electing governments and then helping the government bring Ukraine into Europe. Now, my biggest enemy when I was working in Ukraine was Vladimir Putin, because Putin was vehemently against Ukraine becoming part of Europe. And so when this whole Russian, collusion narrative with me centered as the link to the Kremlin came out, I laughed. I didn't take it seriously because everything I was doing in Ukraine was public information. My role there was public information. I'd even worked with the Obama administration in removing nuclear weapons from Ukraine, which was an important part of Obama's early agenda as president, in dealing with taking nukes out of the world, out of circulation. So when the Russian collusion narrative started, I didn't take it seriously. I figured this was just politics as usual. And after the election, the winners will go on to govern, the losers will lick their wounds and figure out how to win next time. And
right?
when we won, I found I was wrong, that the losers weren't going to lick their wounds. They were never going to stop trying to destroy Donald Trump and his presidency, which I find ironic
When
because it's the same people who never recognized Trump's election are the people who today are talking about January 6th being the biggest threat to democracy, a demonstration on the Hill. And so it's just totally out of comparison. But that's the way the left works. I mean, facts aren't relevant. All that's relevant is trying to create narratives, spread them, smear, and destroy.
Right, absolutely. When did the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you realized, wow, I'm going to be caught in the crosshairs of this?
Well, when the Steele dossier came out in early January, before Trump became president, but almost right around January 6th or 7th, I realized that this was going to last longer. That the House Intel Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee were going to create investigations. But again, I knew there was no Russian collusion, so I figured we'll get through it. But then when I saw what they did to Flynn, when he was doing his job as National Security Advisor designate to meet with all ambassadors, I started to get nervous. And then I saw when Jeff Sessions recused himself from dealing with anything on the campaign, including Russian collusion, that's when I started to get nervous. Because I feared at that point in time that the deep state was going to try and get a special counsel, which of course they did. And at that point, I started to lawyer up because I knew that it didn't matter. The facts didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. This was a political fight, and my life was at risk.
Right, absolutely. And you were right. You were right. You knew that that was coming. Talk to me about, we hear George Soros a lot, and I've read some things that really he might have pointed people towards you because he saw you as a threat. From what I gather, because a while back the president he wanted to be elected in Ukraine wasn't, and therefore he didn't get his part of the deal. I believe it was the pipeline. Does that all tie together?
Well, I did affect his economic interests with my work in Ukraine. There's no question about that. But he also was aligned with people who were associated with uh, the Democrats and their interest in Ukraine. Because of the Durham investigation, a lot of dots have gotten connected that weren't connected before. And I put them in my book. But one of the things I learned, and this sort of brings it right current to what's going on with Hunter Biden, is in 2015, the White House was getting nervous because they were getting a lot of feedback about Hunter Biden's activities around the world, including in Ukraine. And since Joseph Biden, the vice president, was Obama's designated representative to Ukraine, they were concerned about potential conflicts and problems that might pop up. So the way they dealt with it, after they briefed Biden on it, from what we found out, Biden didn't do anything about it. And so the next thing they decided was they better get some deflection going. So they knew I was very active in Ukraine. The Soros network was dealing with the DNC on a bunch of stuff. And so they tried to find dirt on me in Ukraine to deflect the Hunter Biden stuff if and when it would ever come out. I didn't know this until the Durham investigation, although I always felt there was something going on. I didn't understand why that would be. But they were clearly, before there was an even concept of Russian collusion, they were trying to dirty me up to offset the damage that Hunter Biden had caused. But the problem they had is I didn't do business in Ukraine because of the corruption. I ran campaigns. I helped get Ukraine into Europe, but I didn't do the kind of business deals that Hunter Biden was doing because I didn't want the spillback to get in the way of what was important to me, which was bringing Ukraine into Europe. And so the effort failed. But that effort created a ground, if you will, for what became then the Russian collusion narrative when Clinton decided to push it, and so they just picked up threads of that and embellished to their fancy, stories about me that weren't true, much of which came out in the Steele dossier later in the year.
Right, right. And you've historically been against what Putin is about. So it's so backwards from
I,
the
fought the
actual.
Soviet Union, I fought the Soviet Union and Russia my whole life. I mean, the work I was doing in Angola against the Russian propped up government in Angola, what I was doing in the Middle East, what I was doing in Africa, was against everything that Putin and Russia were involved in. And more importantly, in Ukraine, the ultimate issue, which he's now at war on, of trying to capture Ukraine back into his control. I was the leading person behind working with the Ukraine government to bring them into Europe. So to say that I was a link to the Kremlin, it had no credibility for anybody who just read anything that had been going on in the last 10 years in Ukraine. But again, what I didn't appreciate it then, I do now. Facts don't matter. The linkages
Right.
and smear campaign, as Nancy Pelosi called it, that they did to us. And she said we did it to them. But the way they smeared us, I mean, that's all that mattered. And it worked. I mean, because they were able to ensnare me. I got through it, but they thought they would be able to capture me, break me, and get me to give them what they wanted. But I wasn't going to lie, and I didn't, and I went to jail for it.
Do you feel that the saying "the truth shall set you free" has weight to it? Do you feel
I
free?
do. I do. I never felt. I mean, I felt the shackles of prison, but I never felt that I was not free. I don't know how to say that more clearly, I guess, but the truth and my faith and my family got me through that. I didn't know how it was going to end, but I had no doubt it would end in a proper way. And what I refused to do when I was in prison and in solitary was to get sort of sad about my situation or despair about my situation. I refuse to live in the past. Why does this? Woe is me. And I didn't live in the future either. I lived in the present. I focused on every day. I focused on the fact that I was innocent. I focused on the fact of my faith, and I focused on the belief that this will come. This too will pass, and it did.
That was a big question for me, because it's like I truly believe in the sentiment of that saying, but that had to have been tough throughout. But I want to go back to something. I think, is it FARA, Foreign
Sure.
Agent Registration Act? Weren't you the first ever criminally charged under
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
Like the
Yes. But
first ever?
the story's even worse than that. Because of this stuff that was done with in 2015, when Clinton decided to have this pop up, after Robbie Mooks was told by her to start the Russian collusion narrative, they created a black ledger, which was a fake document in Ukraine, one page, my signature on it, which wasn't my signature, cash I was supposedly getting that I never got, and that triggered people at the Department of Justice in the FARA office to contact me. Now, FARA basically requires that if you represent a foreign government or interest in the United States, you need to register with the Department of Justice. It's just
So you were pardoned on December 23rd, 2020. I mean, that's incredible, and there's so much we could dive into. Can you touch on that real quick?
it was a very emotional moment for me. I was hoping I was home. I got home in May from COVID because of COVID, but I was in house arrest. I was limited in my freedom. I wasn't really free. I just wasn't in a prison. After the elections, and the disappointment of the elections, I at least felt that if I'm going to get pardoned, I now know the time frame. It'll certainly be before January 20th, and I was hoping it would be in around Thanksgiving. It wasn't, but the president did, do a pre-Christmas grouping, and I was one of them. And I actually heard about it earlier in the day. It's in my book. I talk about it from early in the morning from a friend of mine in the media, and I didn't want to believe it because my lawyers hadn't called me on it. The White House, hadn't put out anything. But I was told that at 5:00 the pardon would be released, and once it's released on the White House bulletin board, it's immediate. So at 5:00 that evening, I knew that I was going to be free again for the first time in 6 years, and.
Wow.
And so I went. My wife was asleep. This was about 7:30 in the morning. I woke her up. I told her what was going to happen. She looked at me. We both held each other and cried. It was a very emotional moment. And I felt, even though as I said to you earlier in this interview, although I never felt the shackles of prison, I felt the exuberance of freedom as I hugged my wife and did cry.
Oh, I can only imagine that moment. And thank God President Trump did that, because you were wronged in so many ways, but you have so much poise through it all, I must say. And I know I wasn't in there with you, experiencing your emotions as you went through them, but just what I've seen of you through this, you really carry yourself well, and you should be just proud of
Well,
that, because not everyone can handle things like this as eloquently as you have. And
well, you never
I want
prepared for it. You never prepared for it. But the last thing I
right.
wanted to do was put fear in my wife of me being fearful, and I didn't want the Weissman or any of the people on the other side to think they were getting to me.
Good. I love that. I absolutely love that. So, everybody watching, you have to pick up this book, because, I mean, this interview could be 3+ hours. There's so much to you, so much you've achieved outside of this. But this book dives into those details. And again, I can't wait to read it cover to cover. Where can people pick up your book?
It's out in the public. It's in bookstores now. You can get it on Amazon online. Get it on Barnes and Nobles online. You can get it on Simon and Schuster online. So it's readily available now.
Excellent. And where can people find you if they want to connect with you? Social media or a website?
Yeah, I mean, I'm at Paul Manafort on Twitter and at Truth Social, and I can be reached there.
Excellent. I'm sure Trump loved that plug there. Excellent. All right, it's a great platform. Thank you so much for spending your evening here with us, and thank you for doing all of you've done for our country, and your strength is really remarkable.
Thank you, Kristen, and tell your husband we're with him as well as you deal with your fight against for freedom in Portland.
Thank you. I will. I really appreciate you. Have a wonderful evening.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in. What an amazing man. And wow, that made me tear up a tiny bit. And I'm not an emotional person. But thank you guys for tuning in. Go get that book, please, and get the actual physical copy. I keep telling you guys, we're not always going to have the audio version of books. Things are going to be taken away from us. The truth is going to be more and more difficult to get your hands on. So go pick up a physical copy of that book today. And we'll see you next Thursday on KSOK Uncensored.